The snow does not ask permission before it buries you. It simply falls, white and patient and indifferent, and covers everything you ever were until all that remains is the shape of your outline pressed into the cold ground. A suggestion of a person, a memory of warmth. That was what Vigora Tormnail had become in the hours since the caravan abandoned her. A suggestion. She had not cried when the men rode away. She had stood very still in the middle of the mountain pass, her red cloak whipping against her body like a wound, and she had watched the torchlight of their horses disappear into the white dark. The wind screamed between the peaks. The cold pressed against her face with the intimacy of something that wanted to consume her. She had not cried, not because she was brave, but because she had expected it. That was the worst part. How unsurprised she had been. All her life, Vigora had been the kind of woman that people looked past. Not ugly, not unkind, not unworthy, simply overlooked. She had grown up in a small pack in the eastern reaches of the Tormnail territory, the daughter of a beta couple who had died young and left her to the mercy of a matriarch with cold eyes and colder hands. She had learned early that the world was not built to hold people like her. The world was built for the loud, the golden, the chosen. Vigora was none of those things. She was white-haired, which the elders said was a sign of something strange in her blood. Pale-skinned, which some whispered meant she carried the old magic, though no one could say what that meant exactly, or why it should matter. She was quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable, as if her silence were an accusation, and she was an omega, which in the hierarchy of pack society meant she was soft clay, meant to be shaped, meant to be useful, meant to serve the purpose others assigned to her. The mail-order arrangement had been her matriarch's idea. An alpha king in the north needed a new Luna. The matriarch needed gold and political favor. Vigora had been offered like a piece of furniture, presented, packaged, sent. She had not been consulted. She had gone anyway. Not because she had no choice, though she had very little of one, but because some small, stubborn part of her had dared to hope. It was the same part that kept her reading the old stories by candlelight, the same part that had always believed, foolishly, desperately, that the world contained more beauty than it had yet shown her. That small part was still breathing now, even as her knees hit the snow. She had been walking for 3 hours since the men left. The path had grown steeper, and the wind had become a living thing, howling through the mountain throat with a fury that made thought impossible. Her feet were numb. The red of her cloak was the only color in the entire white world, and it felt almost obscene, that red, too vivid, too alive, too insistent against the erasure of the storm. Her hands had stopped shaking 20 minutes ago. She knew enough about cold to know that was not a good sign. She fell to her knees without meaning to. The snow received her without ceremony. For a moment she simply knelt there, her white hair plastered to her face by the ice-laced wind, and she let herself be very honest about what was happening. She was dying. The cold was inside her now, not just outside. It had crossed some threshold while she was still walking, while she was still telling herself she would find shelter, while she was still pretending the small, hopeful part of her heart had been right about the world. The snow was beautiful. She had not expected to notice that in this moment, but it was. The way it fell in the lantern dark. There were no lanterns, she realized, but there was something, some pale phosphorescent glow from the snow itself, was genuinely, achingly beautiful. Like a curtain being drawn, like the world preparing itself for something. Her eyes were closing. The hoofbeats came from the east. She did not look up at first. The sound seemed like something her mind was manufacturing. Warmth fantasy, the last invention of a body refusing to accept its end. But it grew louder, steady, real. And then the horse was there, a great black animal steaming in the cold, and the figure on its back was enormous and dark, and pulling on the reins with a controlled violence that brought the animal to an immediate, trembling stop. Vigora looked up. The man on the horse looked down. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. He was very large. She registered that first. The sheer physical scale of him, the breadth of his shoulders beneath the heavy fur-lined cloak, the way he seemed to take up more space than any single person should. His hair was black and slightly disheveled from the ride, the waves pressing against his jaw and the back of his neck. He wore a short beard, dark and precise. His eyes were dark too, very dark, the color of winter forest at night. They were looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not cold, not warm, somewhere in the complicated middle, where emotion lives before it commits to a name. He said nothing for a beat too long. Then he was off the horse. He moved with a speed and sureness that seemed at odds with the chaos of the storm, dismounting, crossing the distance between them, crouching before her in one continuous motion. Up close, the size of him was almost alarming. He blocked the wind. She realized, distantly, that she could no longer feel the wind against her face, because his body was between her and it. "How long have you been out here?" His voice was very low. Not gentle exactly. It was not the voice of a man practiced in gentleness, but it was controlled in a way that felt deliberate, like he was holding something back. Vigora opened her mouth. 3 hours, she managed. Perhaps more. Something moved across his face, a tightening. His jaw worked once. Without a word, he reached behind him and unclasped his cloak. It was massive, thick wool lined with something dark and dense, still warm from his body. He dropped it around her shoulders in one motion, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. She made a sound she did not intend to make, something small and involuntary, a sound of pure animal relief. His hands paused on the cloak's edges. Just for a fraction of a second, he stilled. Then he pulled the cloak tighter around her and scooped her up from the ground. She was in his arms before she had time to protest, and then she was on the horse before she had time to be embarrassed about being in his arms. And then he was behind her, one forearm braced across her middle like an iron bar, and the horse was moving. She felt the warmth of him at her back, enormous, steady, infuriatingly alive, and she kept her spine rigid for exactly 40 seconds before her body surrendered and leaned into it. The snow kept falling. The castle appeared out of the storm like something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. It was massive and dark and old, the kind of old that was not just age but endurance, the kind of structure that had survived enough that it had stopped worrying about surviving. Towers rose into the white sky. The gates opened before they reached them, as if the walls themselves recognized the man on the horse. Vigora was half-conscious by the time he carried her inside. She had a fragmented impression of firelight and stone corridors and voices, servants appearing from doorways, moving quickly, speaking in low, urgent tones. She heard a woman's voice, professional and calm, issuing instructions. She felt herself lowered onto something soft. Blankets. Warmth, pressing in from multiple directions. Hands. Different hands, careful and practiced, doing things to her feet and her face and checking her temperature. She tried to say something. "Rest," said a voice very close. The same voice from the snow, the low one, the one that was holding something back. She rested. She woke to gray light and the sound of fire. The room was stone-walled and high-ceilinged, the kind of room that belonged to a castle that had never tried to be cozy and had achieved a certain austere grandeur instead. The bed was enormous. The blankets were heavy and warm. A fire burned in a fireplace wide enough to stand in, and the light it cast was orange and steady and deeply, profoundly comforting. Vigora sat up carefully. Her feet were wrapped. Her hands had been treated with something that smelled of pine and snow mint. Her red cloak was folded neatly on a chair near the window. She was alive. The door opened. She had been expecting a servant. Instead, Silas Yerman walked in. In the light of an indoor fire, without the storm pressing context around everything, he was... She searched for the word. Formidable. That was the only honest word. He wore dark clothing, simpler than she would have expected for a king, though the fabric was obviously fine. The lines of his body were stark and precise. All that muscle carried without apparent effort, without vanity, simply present the way mountains are present. His black hair was dry now, the waves settling into something almost elegant around his jaw. The beard was shorter than she had initially perceived, a careful architecture of darkness along a face that seemed to have been built for severity. His eyes found her immediately. "You're awake." The words came out the way a man states a fact he has been quietly waiting to confirm. "Yes." Vigora straightened. "Thank you for everything, finding me, bringing me here." She paused. "I'm sorry to have been an inconvenience." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, a fractional tightening, as if that word had landed incorrectly somewhere inside him. "You weren't an inconvenience." Still, she met his gaze. She had learned to hold the gaze of alphas when she was very young, not out of defiance but out of necessity. Men who thought you couldn't look them in the eye tended to treat you accordingly. "I owe you my life." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the chair away from the window, the one her cloak was folded on, and sat down. He moved her cloak to the side without a second thought and sat facing her, elbows on his knees, the way a man sits when he has decided to hear something properly. "Tell me what happened," Vigora told him. She told him about the arrangement, the matriarch, the gold, the agreement, the men who had been sent to escort her north. She told him about the journey and the way the men had spoken to her in the caravan, the casual cruelty of their dismissal, the things they had said about the king, and about her, and about the impossibility of this ever meaning anything. She told him about the storm, and the decision they had made, and being left on the road. She told it plainly, without self-pity, without drama, just the facts of it in order. She watched his face while she spoke. His expression did not change precisely, but something underneath it did. Something in the deep architecture of his jaw and the set of his eyes that had nothing to do with the muscles of his face. It was something older than expression, something that lived in the body before the mind catches up with it. When she finished, there was silence. "The men who escorted you," Silas said carefully, very quietly. "Their names." It was not a question. "I don't know all of them," Vigora answered. "The captain was called Morrow." "There was another man. Byrne, I think." Silas did not say anything. His jaw tightened one time, so precisely and so briefly that she might have imagined it. Then he stood. "You'll stay here until you've recovered, and then we will discuss what comes next." He was halfway to the door when something made Vigora speak. She did not fully understand why she said it. Perhaps it was the fire, or the feeling of having been truly warm for the first time in days, or some deeply embedded instinct she had never had cause to act on before. "They said you still loved your late queen," Vigora called after him. "That was why they left me. They said you wouldn't want me, that anyone sent in this arrangement was a waste of your time." Silas stopped with his back to her. The room was very quiet. They were not entirely wrong about my heart. His voice was different. Something in it had opened, just slightly, like a door that has not been used in years, but will still move if you press with the right kind of pressure. But they were wrong about everything else. He left. Vigora sat in the warmth of the fire and pressed her palm against her sternum, where something odd had begun to pulse. She had felt it in the snow, when his warmth surrounded her from behind, and her body had finally surrendered to it. She had felt it again when he sat down and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, "Tell me what happened," as if her answer genuinely mattered. It was not attraction, precisely, or not only attraction. It was something more structural than that, something that felt less like wanting and more like recognition. As if some part of her had been oriented toward this room, this fire, this man, for a very long time, and had simply not known what direction it was pointing in. She pressed her palm harder against her chest, and told herself it was probably just gratitude. She was quite aware that she was lying to herself. The days that followed were quiet in the way that precedes something louder. Vigora recovered quickly, more quickly than the healer, a brisk woman named Essa, seemed to expect. By the second day, she was walking the corridors. By the third, she had found the library. By the fourth, the kitchen staff had decided she was quiet but not unfriendly, and had begun leaving small things, a cup of something warm, a plate of bread and honey, outside the library door in the late afternoon. She did not see Silas. She heard him, occasionally, heard the sound of his voice from down long corridors, heard the measured thunder of his footsteps at odd hours, heard him in the training yard in the early mornings when she could not sleep, and sat in the window of her room watching the gray pre-dawn light break over the mountains. He trained with a controlled ferocity that seemed almost meditative, punishing the practiced dummy, working with his guard in combinations that were brutal and precise, and beautiful in the way that mastery of any difficult thing is beautiful. He had removed his outer garments, and his torso was... She looked away. She looked back. She looked away again more decisively. On the fifth day, he found her in the library. She did not hear him come in. One moment she was alone among the shelves, sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a book about the Northern Territory's ancient pack lineages, and the next he was there, standing in the doorway with an expression that suggested he had walked in, intending to do something else, and had found her instead. "You found the library." The door was open. Was I not meant to be here? No, you may be wherever you wish." He paused. Then, with a deliberateness that felt like a man choosing to step onto uncertain ground, "What are you reading?" She showed him the spine. He crossed the room and took it from her with a careful motion, turned it over, examined it. "You can read the old notation?" he asked. "I was taught by an elder in my pack, before she died. She seemed to think it was important." A pause. "I never understood why." Silas turned a page. "This section here," he turned the book and pointed to a passage she had been struggling with, "is about the lineage records of the northern packs. The notation shifts here because the scribe was recording from two sources simultaneously." He was pointing at the page with one large hand, and she leaned forward slightly to follow his finger, and the proximity was... She sat back. "You know the old notation," she observed. "I was raised with these texts." He closed the book and set it on the seat beside her, and then, after a moment, sat down himself, not on the window seat, which would have been too close, but in the tall armchair adjacent to it. He settled into it with the ease of someone who had sat in it before, many times. "My mother believed the old records were more important than most people credited." "Was she right?" "She was right about most things." A beat. "She died when I was 14. Vigora looked at him. He was looking at the fire. There was a smaller one here in the library, built into an alcove between the shelves, with an expression she recognized now. Not grief exactly. Something that lives on the other side of grief, when you have grieved so completely that all that remains is the permanent altered shape of you. I'm sorry. Her voice was quiet. It was a long time ago. He paused. Though I don't think time is actually the variable that matters. No, she agreed quietly. I don't think it is either. He looked at her then, and she held his gaze with the steadiness she had learned young, but this time it did not feel like defense. It felt like two people standing on opposite sides of a very narrow river, both understanding the water was shallow enough to cross. He stayed for 2 more hours. They talked about the texts, about the pack histories, about the Northern Territory's relationship with the mountain clans. He was not warm in the way that some men perform warmth, open and easy and radiantly welcoming. He was something more measured than that. His attention was like a held door, deliberate, precise, and once given, entirely committed. She walked back to her room that night with that strange pulse in her chest beating harder than before. It became a pattern, not every day. Some days his duties kept him remote, and she would hear him in the great hall, or watch from a distance as he met with his guard commanders, or catch a glimpse of him in the courtyard with the controlled severity of a man who carried his authority the way soldiers carry weapons. Always present, always ready, never sheathed. She watched him in those public moments with an attention she tried to keep casual and failed at entirely, and she saw what the men in the caravan had meant when they implied that this man could not be softened. He was not soft in the world. He was not soft with his commanders or his advisors, or the delegation from the border territories that arrived on the 8th day and tested his patience in ways that were visible from across the great hall. He was direct to the edge of severity and seemed to locate compromise somewhere between his position and also his position. He had a particular quality of stillness in conflict that was more frightening than aggression, the quality of something that has decided, that has fully committed, and is simply waiting for the other party to understand this. But in the library with her, and then later in the garden, because the library led to the garden, the way one good thing tends to lead to another, he was different. Not soft exactly, but the severity had a different texture. It was quieter, less a wall and more an open space. He asked questions and listened to the answers with his full attention. He disagreed with her occasionally, and said so directly and without apology, but he was genuinely interested in her counter-argument. He had opinions about everything, the old texts, the territorial politics, the pack traditions he had maintained, and those he had let lapse, the function of ritual in community, the proper management of the beehives in the Eastern Garden, which he had apparently developed strong views on. He was completely unsentimental about most things, and quietly, fiercely sentimental about a very few. She learned. He slept little. He ran the northern perimeter in the early mornings, alone, before his guard was awake. He had built a small stone marker at the edge of the forest where Kasira's ashes had been scattered, and he visited it once a week, and he did not speak of it, but she had seen him there through her window. He preferred silence to noise, action to deliberation, cold to warmth. He kept the library stocked for a castle of people who mostly did not read. He learned. She had been reading since she was 4 years old, taught by the dying elder who seemed to believe vigorous literacy was a matter of some urgency. She made bread when she was anxious, and the kitchen staff had begun to notice. She was not afraid of heights or dark or cold, but she had a specific and irrational discomfort with very still water. She laughed quietly, not often, but when she did, it tended to arrive unexpectedly, and it changed her face entirely. Something opened in it, something unguarded and bright and startling. On the evening of the 12th day, he laughed too. It was in the garden. The snow had eased. It was still cold, still winter. But the storm had moved east, and the sky was clear and enormous above the castle walls, dense with stars. She had made a comment about the beehives that had been entirely sincere and entirely, accidentally absurd, and he had looked at her for a moment with that unreadable expression. And then the laugh had come. Quiet, brief, almost surprised, as if the sound had escaped before he had time to decide whether to allow it. The sound of it went through her like something breaking open. She turned to look at him and caught the last of it. The way the severity of his face held something else in that moment, something younger and unguarded, something that had clearly not been let out often in recent years. He noticed her noticing. Neither of them said anything. The stars were very bright above the garden wall. She had been there 3 weeks when the council called for a formal decision. Silas told her himself, which she had not expected. He came to find her in the kitchen. She had been making bread, because she had been anxious since the previous morning, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is choosing now to abandon the rehearsed version. The council believes the arrangement should proceed, a formal ceremony. They want it within the month. Vigora pressed her palms against the flowery table. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the question seemed to expand to fill the kitchen. "I want to be honest with you," Silas began at last. "Cassira she was my life for the time we had. I don't know how to explain the weight of that. I have not tried since she died to—" He stopped. Began again. "I am not an easy man." "I'm aware," Vigora said. Something moved in his expression. "And you're not frightened of that." "I have been cold and abandoned in a mountain pass," Vigora said mildly. "You're very large and very serious, and occasionally you have the social warmth of a stone fortification. But no, I'm not frightened of you." He looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to know you better," Silas said very carefully. "Before any ceremony. I would like it to be a choice, a real one, for both of us." Vigora felt that pulse in her chest again, deep and steady and strange. That seemed sensible. "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them mentioned that they had been knowing each other better, a little more each day, for 3 weeks already. Neither of them mentioned the garden or the library or the way his whole bearing shifted when he sat across from her in the firelight. Neither of them mentioned the pulse. They didn't need to. Some things announced themselves without requiring words. It was on the 19th night that Vigora found the corridor. She had been restless. The bread-making anxiety had not fully resolved itself, and she had risen from bed well past midnight and walked the castle corridors the way she sometimes did when sleep wouldn't hold her. The castle at night was a different place, darker, older, the stone walls releasing a chill that the fires barely touched, the shadows in the alcoves profound and velvet thick. She had taken a wrong turn somewhere near the west wing, and found herself in a corridor she had not been in before. It was different from the rest of the castle, quieter, in a way that felt almost deliberate. The stones were older here, or perhaps just less trafficked, the kind of stillness that accumulates in places that are not often entered. There were objects along the walls, a pair of sconces, unlit. A portrait that she paused before for a moment. A woman with dark eyes, not beautiful in a formal way, but vivid, present, her face captured mid-thought rather than mid-pose. Vigora moved on. She was almost to the end of the corridor when the headache hit. It came without warning. A sudden violent pressure behind her eyes, like something pressing outward from inside her skull. She gasped and caught herself against the wall, one hand flat against the cold stone. The corridor seemed to tilt. And then the images came. Not dreams. She was awake, fully awake, her heart hammering. But the images arrived over her vision like a second sight laid on top of the first, translucent and vivid and horrifyingly detailed. A great hall, not this one. Larger, older, the ceiling higher, torches in iron brackets. a throne of dark stone with silver threading through the rock. A woman standing before the throne in a silver crown, speaking to someone outside the frame of the vision. The woman's voice, Vigora could hear the voice though she could not make out the words, was calm and clear, and carried the weight of authority without effort. And then the hall was changing. The torches were flickering. Someone was shouting, many voices suddenly overlapping. And there was movement, a surge of bodies, and the woman with the crown turned and her face was... It was... Vigora could not hold the image. The pressure in her skull spiked, blinding white, and she dropped. She hit the corridor floor on her knees and the vision shattered, and she was in the present, in the cold corridor, gasping, her white hair loose and damp with sudden sweat, her whole body shaking. She sat on the floor of the corridor for a very long time. The images were still there when she closed her eyes. The great hall, the silver crown, the throne, the torches. The sound of shouting that had begun as voices and turned into something animal and desperate. She had never seen any of it before, and yet she had known, with the absolute certainty that comes from some part of the mind that does not deal in reason, that she had been there. She did not hear him coming. Vigora. Silas was crouching before her the way he had crouched in the snow, and for one disorienting moment, she was in both places simultaneously. The mountain pass and this corridor, the killing cold and the castle chill. Then and now. His hands were on her shoulders, steadying. His face was very close and very focused, and he was looking at her with an expression that was too raw to have any pretense left in it. What happened? The same low voice. But this time nothing was being held back. She told him. She watched him while she told him. She watched the expression move across his face. Concern, alertness, something she could not name. When she described the hall with the dark stone throne, his jaw tightened. When she described the silver crown, something behind his eyes went very still. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. The throne room, Silas said carefully. You described the throne room from the old keep, the one that burned 300 years ago. He paused. The silver crown, that was the Luna's crown of the original dynasty. It's been in the record texts. There are no paintings of it that I know of. There's only the written description. Vigora looked at him. I've never read those records, Vigora said. I know. The corridor was very quiet. Outside the high windows, the snow had begun again. I don't understand what's happening to me. It came out differently than she had intended. Not frightened, but very honest in a way that bypassed all her usual careful stillness. Silas sat down on the corridor floor beside her. He sat with his back against the wall and his knees up, and looked at the far end of the corridor with the expression of a man arranging his thoughts into an order he can speak in. I want to show you something tomorrow, in the archive. I've had a thought since the moment you arrived. Something that didn't make sense then, but is beginning to. What thought? He looked at her. In the dim corridor light, his eyes were very dark and very direct. I think you were sent here for a reason that has nothing to do with the arrangement. I think you've been here before, in some form. And I think whatever is in you that caused those visions is older than either of us. Vigora pressed her hand against her chest again. The pulse was there, deep and steady, and she had given up pretending she didn't know what it meant. All right. He stayed until her breathing steadied. He did not touch her. Not the way she had half expected, not reassuringly, not the way someone might reach out to comfort. Instead, he remained beside her, solid and present and quiet, which was something she had not known she needed more until she had it. When she finally stood, he rose with her. And when they walked back through the castle toward the inhabited wing, he walked close enough that the cold between them was a distance he had chosen and could close, whenever he decided to. She was aware of that distance with every step. The archive was in the lower levels of the castle, where the walls were oldest and the cold was deepest. Silas had clearly been there before, many times. He moved through it without the lamp, navigating by memory, and only lit the sconce for her sake. The records filled an entire room, bound texts and loose scrolls and sealed cases and stacked parchments, organized in a system that was apparently intuitive to him, because he moved through it like a man following a trail. He found what he was looking for in the third case he opened. It was a scroll, bound in dark leather. He unrolled it on the reading table and stood back and gestured for her to come closer. The lineage of the Luna's blood, the third line of the Northern Dynasty, the one that was broken when the old keep burned. Vigora leaned over the scroll. The notation was the old kind, the kind her dying elder had taught her to read, with an urgency that had never made sense. Until now. She read slowly. The words were dense and formal, the syntax of a language 3 centuries removed from the one spoken now. But the meaning assembled itself clearly as she went, line by line, and with each line something inside her grew colder and quieter and more absolutely certain. The lineage of the Luna's blood was specific. Women born with white hair. The text used the old phrase, hair like the first snow, and she felt a shock of recognition at that. Carrying a mark that would only reveal itself under specific spiritual pressure. Women descended from the original Luna of the Northern Dynasty, who had been separated from her lineage not by choice, but by violence, her children scattered to distant packs in the chaos of the keep's burning. The line had not died. It had only lost its way. And when the Northern Kingdom had need of it, when the balance of the packs was in danger, when the seat of the Luna stood empty too long, one of the lineage would return. Not remembering, not knowing, but drawn, pulled, moved toward the north by something that looked, from the outside, like circumstance, like a mail order arrangement, like a matriarch who saw gold and did not look deeper at what she was selling, like a storm, like a man on a black horse, riding home from the border, taking a road he did not usually take. Vigora stood at the table with her hands pressed flat against the scroll and breathed. She did not look up. If she looked up, she would have to absorb everything at once, and her mind was moving through it piece by piece, carefully, the way you cross very thin ice, 1 foot, pause, balance, next foot. The elder who had taught her to read the old notation, who had died pressing the knowledge into her with an urgency that made no sense, who had sometimes looked at her with an expression that was less like affection and more like recognition of something vast. The visions, the corridor, the throne room, the silver crown, the woman's voice, calm and clear, carrying authority without effort, her white hair, which had marked her strange and other her entire life, the pulse in her chest, which had begun the moment Silas had wrapped his cloak around her in the snow. Silas said, from very close behind her, "The pulse." She turned. He was right there, had moved, without her noticing, from the far side of the table to beside her. His eyes were on her face, searching it. What? The feeling in your chest. You keep pressing your hand against it. You've done it since the first morning. I've seen it. Vigora looked at him. I felt it too, Silas said very quietly. The first time I looked at you, in the snow, something I didn't have a name for. I told myself it was concern, protectiveness, something ordinary. A pause. It isn't ordinary. No, she agreed. In the old texts. He stopped. Began again, more carefully. There are descriptions, in the older lineage records, of what it feels like when an alpha recognizes his true Luna. Not the chosen one, not the arranged one. The one the blood recognizes. He was still holding her gaze, direct and unflinching, the way he was direct about everything. They describe it as a pulse, behind the sternum, like something that has always been there, but has only just found the right frequency. The room was very quiet. "You've been reading the lineage records." "I've been reading them for 19 days, since the morning you woke up in my castle." Vigora turned to face him fully. He was tall above her. She had registered his height as a fact from the beginning, but it felt different now, close and deliberate. His face was doing that thing she had noticed in the library, in the garden. The severity was present, but it had turned into something else, something that used the same lines of his face and produced an entirely different meaning. "I need to tell you something," Vigora said. "Tell me." "I'm not afraid of you being in love with a dead woman." Her voice was steady. "I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but I want you to understand it. I'm not trying to replace her. I wouldn't know how, and I wouldn't want to. What you had with her was its own thing. It belongs to you. It should belong to you." She paused, collecting herself. "But I also need you to know that what I feel when I'm in the same room as you is not... I'm not confusing gratitude for something else. I know the difference." Silas looked at her for a long time. "I know you know the difference. You are not a woman who confuses things." "Then you know I'm telling you accurately." "Yes." The fire in the sconce crackled. The archive was cold around them, all those centuries pressed into the stone, all that recorded history waiting. "Kassira was the love of my life," Silas said. His voice was very steady, the way things are steady when they have been said quietly inside a person 1,000 times and have finally been allowed out. "I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not dishonor her by pretending. But she is gone. And the world kept moving after she left, even when I wanted it to stop." A pause. "I spent 3 years waiting for my heart to stop surprising me with its continuing to beat. And then I found you in the snow." Vigora's breath was very careful. "What I feel for you," he said, "is not a replacement. It is not a consolation. It is its own thing, new and strange, and completely unexpected. And I have been trying to understand it for 19 days, and I have arrived at the only honest conclusion, which is that I cannot." He let out a breath. "And I've decided I don't need to understand it. I only need to know whether it is real, and it is real." She said, "It is real." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then his hand came up and touched her face. Not urgently, not with the impulsive energy of someone crossing a line, but with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision fully and is now simply acting on it. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that was startling in its contrast to every other way she had seen him move. She leaned into it. He exhaled. Something in him eased. She could see it, like a very old door finally letting the light in. "I should speak with the council," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "and the elders, about the lineage." He was still touching her face, apparently with no immediate intention of stopping. "It will not be simple. There are people who will question the validity of the claim. There are politics." "Silas," she said. He paused. "I am aware," she said gently, "that it will not be simple. But that has never, in my experience, been sufficient reason not to do the right thing." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, so briefly and so quietly that she might have imagined it, "No, it isn't." But they had not yet seen the part that would not be simple. The council meeting was 3 days later, and it was, as predicted, not simple. The elders arrived from the outer territories, 4 of them, ancient and precise in the way that old power tends to be, wearing the formal marks of their lineage and looking at Vigora with an attention that was both respectful and deeply evaluating. The council members were present, 9 of them, the heads of the castle's administrative and military functions. Men and women who had served under Silas for years and had very clear ideas about what the Northern Kingdom required. Silas laid the scroll on the table. He laid the other records beside it. The lineage documents, the descriptions from the older texts, the account of the corridor visions, which Vigora had written out in the old notation at S's suggestion, so that the accuracy of the details could be verified against the sealed records. There was a very long silence. Elder Mara, the oldest of the four, her white hair braided with dark cord in the tradition of the Western Territories, looked at the documents, then looked at Vigora, then looked at the documents again. "The corridor she described," she said. "The exact position of the sconces, the color of the stone, the design of the throne." She looked at Silas. "These details are not in any publicly accessible record. They appear only in the sealed archive." "Yes," Silas said. She could not have read the sealed archive. No. Elder Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "The throne room burned 300 years ago. It was rebuilt in the Eastern style in the subsequent decade. There is no surviving structural record of the original that we have not sealed." A pause that was heavy with the weight of 3 centuries. For this woman to have seen it. "She didn't read it," said one of the council members, a young commander named Eris. "She was sent here by a matriarch looking to turn political coin. We have no way to verify." "Eris." Silas's voice was quiet. It was the very particular quietness of something about to be extremely definitive. Eris stopped. "The evidence is documented," Silas said. "The archive is sealed and was sealed before she arrived. The accounts are verified." He paused, one beat. "I would ask that the discussion proceed accordingly." Eris subsided. The council exchanged glances. Elder Mara stood. She moved to Vigora's end of the table with the unhurried certainty of someone who has done this before, in one form or another, across many decades. She stood before Vigora and looked at her with eyes that were pale and very clear, eyes that had seen enough that nothing in them performed. "Show me your left wrist," she said. Vigora frowned, but she complied, turning her wrist up. The elder produced a small silver instrument from her belt. No, not an instrument, a seal, the kind used in the oldest pack ceremonies. She pressed it to Vigora's wrist without explanation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, and Vigora felt it before she saw it. A warmth moved up her arm from the point of contact. Not painful, the opposite of painful. A warmth that felt like sun on skin after a long winter, like water when you have been thirsty, like the first moment of warmth in Silas's cloak in the snow. And then, on Vigora's wrist, in the skin, something appeared. It was a mark. Silver white, like moonlight on moving water, like the frost patterns that form on winter glass. The shape of it was ancient. She had seen it in the lineage scroll, at the head of the section on the Luna's blood. The room was completely silent. Elder Mara stepped back. She looked at Silas with the expression of a woman who has waited a long time to see a particular thing, and is now choosing her words with corresponding care. "The Luna's mark," she said. "Dormant since the burning. Active only in the presence of the legitimate heir's blood." She paused. "Your kingdom's Luna has come home, Alpha King." Silas did not look at the elder. He was looking at Vigora, and Vigora was looking at her wrist and at the silver mark that had lived in her blood without her knowledge for the entirety of her life, and feeling the pulse in her chest beating with a clarity and certainty she had no remaining argument against. She looked up. He was still looking at her, and his expression, that complex, controlled, difficult face, was doing something she had seen once before, briefly, in the garden when he had laughed. Something unguarded. Something that lived on the other side of all that severity like a different man who had been there all along. She thought, "I found you." She thought, with a certainty that felt like something clicking into place. I found you, and you found me, and we have been finding each other for longer than either of us knew. The council did not reach unanimous agreement that day. Eris continued his objections through the afternoon, with the tenacity of a man who had invested significantly in the world, working a particular way. 2 other council members raised procedural concerns, legitimate ones, she acknowledged, about the lineage claim and its implications for the succession. But Elder Mara had spoken. And the elder's word carried a weight in the north that had been accumulating for decades, the weight of someone who has been consistently right about the things that matter. The arguments continued for 2 more weeks. In those 2 weeks, other things happened. Silas and Vigora moved through the castle differently. Not publicly. Both of them were careful about that. Careful about the appearance of the decisions that the council was still formally deliberating. But privately, in the library and the garden and the kitchen where she made bread when she was anxious, and where he had begun to appear in the late afternoons with the expression of a man who has found the gravitational pull of a particular place entirely rational. Privately, they were moving closer. He told her about Kasira. Not everything at once. It came in pieces, the way deep things tend to come. A little at a time when the timing felt honest rather than performed. He told her about meeting Kasira at a winter gathering when they were both young and severe and mutually convinced the other was insufferable. He told her about the 7 years of their marriage, the way the castle had sounded when she was in it. She had been noisy, he said, not in a difficult way, just present, vivid, filling rooms. He told her about the illness. Rapid, brutal, the worst kind, and the 3 years since, and the stone marker at the forest's edge. Vigora listened to all of it. She listened the way she had learned to listen. Fully, without filling the silence, without performing understanding she didn't feel, or softening truths that should be allowed their full weight. When he had finished telling her about the night Kasira died, the worst night she understood, the one he had never told anyone about. She said nothing for a long time. And then she said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." He was quiet. "It doesn't ask anything of you," she added. "What I feel for you. It doesn't ask you to pretend she didn't exist, or to love her less, or to make what we have compete with what you had. It only asks to be itself." He turned from the window to look at her with an expression she had no word for yet, a particular quality of being seen, of recognition, of the very specific relief of being understood by someone who is not trying to comfort you into a simpler version of your own grief. He crossed the room, and he sat beside her, and he took her hand. They sat like that for a long time, in the library, while the fire burned down and the stars appeared over the garden wall. His hand was very warm. On the night of the 28th day, Vigora woke again with the visions. This time they were different. They began the same way, the pressure behind her eyes, the sudden surge of other sight. The great hall with the dark stone throne, the woman with the silver crown, but this time she could see the woman's face. It was not her face. It was a different woman entirely. Older, darker-haired. A woman who carried some quality in her bearing that Vigora recognized the way you recognize music you have heard before, in a different key. The woman turned and looked directly at her, which should have been impossible, which was impossible, and said something in the very old language that Vigora only partly understood. She understood enough. The words were, "You are not the end. You are the return." Vigora sat up in the dark of her room and held her own hands together and thought about that. You are not the end. She had always felt like she was the last of something, the last claim on a line that had run out, the last attempt at a life that the world had been quietly declining to offer her, the last hope of a matriarch who had seen her as currency rather than a person, the last woman who would be sent on a journey and abandoned. You are the return. She sat in the dark and breathed until the trembling stopped. When she opened the door to her room, Silas was in the corridor. He was standing a few feet away, which meant he had either been walking the corridor or had come to check on her. He looked at her without surprise, as if he had expected this, as if some sense she did not have a name for had told him she would be awake. "The visions again?" he said. "A different one." She pulled the door wider. "Come in. I need to tell you." He came in. She told him. He sat in the chair by the fire that she had begun to think of as his, and he listened with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on her face. And when she finished, he was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "You are not the end. You are the return." He said it again, softly, in the old language, and it landed differently in that tongue. Heavier, more ancient, more certain. The old texts use this phrasing for the Luna who returns after the lineage's disruption. It's a recognition formula. He paused. "The woman in the vision said it to you." "Yes." "That means she recognized you." He looked at her. "Across 300 years. Across whatever it is that connects your blood to hers. She recognized you." Vigora pressed her hand against her chest. The pulse was very strong tonight. "I've been afraid," she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said since arriving. Not of the visions, of belonging here, of believing I actually belong here, after a whole life of... She stopped. "I have always been the thing that other people looked past. The white hair, the quiet, the Omega who got passed around like something nobody particularly wanted, but nobody quite knew how to refuse." She swallowed. "It is a very strange thing to consider the possibility that you were not overlooked, but that you were simply in the wrong place." Silas stood from the chair. He stood very deliberately, in the way he did things he had decided, and he crossed the room, and he stood in front of her. "You were in the wrong place," he said, very clearly, "and now you're not." She looked up at him. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she agreed. "So when I say that this castle is more itself with you in it than it has been in 3 years, that's not a comfortable thing I'm telling you. It's accurate." He paused. "You were not overlooked, Vigora. You were saved for a place that was ready to see you." She was aware, distantly, that she should probably say something. Instead, she stepped forward and put her arms around him. He went very still, and then he wrapped both arms around her, his whole enormous enveloping warmth, that warmth she had fallen into in the snow and never quite recovered from, and held her with a care so precise and so complete that she felt the last of something loosen in her chest, the last knot, the last held breath of a person who has been braced for the next disappointment for so long that she has forgotten what it feels like to exhale completely. She exhaled. He pressed his jaw against the top of her head, very gently, and stayed. The council voted on the morning of the 32nd day, 7-2. Eris held his objection to the last, and she respected him for it, even though she disagreed with him entirely. The 2 dissenting votes were recorded and acknowledged and filed in the archive with the rest of the record. Elder Mara announced the formal recognition of the Luna's lineage claim at noon in the Great Hall, before the full assembly of the castle's community. It was a ceremony older than the current dynastic line, a ceremony that had not been performed in 300 years, since the last time the seal had been applied and found an answer in living blood. Vigora stood in the Great Hall in her red cloak and her white hair and the silver mark on her wrist, and she felt the pulse in her chest beating with a certainty that was no longer strange. It was simply part of her, like her heartbeat, like her breath. Silas stood beside her. His hand found hers in the moment before Elder Mara began to speak, and she felt his fingers close around hers, sure, warm, deliberate. His grip was very steady. She held on. After the formal proceedings, there was the matter of what Morrow and his men had done. Silas had been clear about this from the beginning. From the moment, in her room on the morning after her rescue, when he had asked for the names with that particular quiet that was the opposite of anything soft. He had been clear that what they had done was not a private matter between Vigora and a group of cowardly men. It was a violation of an escort duty, and now that the lineage claim was recognized, it was something considerably more serious than that. The men were found in the Eastern Territories, having apparently attempted to return to the pack they had started from. They were brought north under guard. Vigora was asked whether she wanted to be present at the hearing. She said yes. The hearing was in the Great Hall, before the council and the assembled court. Morrow stood before the judgment seat, Silas in it, in the formal robes that made the severity of him into something official and terrifying. And he was not a man she had ever expected to see frightened. He had been large and contemptuous in the caravan, a man cushioned in his own certainty about where power lived and what it required. He was not cushioned now. Silas asked the questions with a measured precision that was more frightening than rage. Not because there was no anger in him. She could see it, the controlled burn of it behind his eyes, the particular stillness of someone holding something very contained. But because the control itself was the statement. Because a man who does not need to shout to be the most dangerous thing in the room is saying something about his own nature that cannot be argued with. Morrow admitted everything. He had no real alternative, with the other men already having given their accounts in exchange for reduced consequences. But she suspected he would have admitted it anyway. There was something in Silas's presence in that chair that made alternatives feel abstract. The judgment was handed down formally and recorded. The relevant consequences were applied under the laws of the Northern Territory. Vigora watched all of it. On the walk back through the castle afterward, Silas was beside her, and she was aware of the shift in him. The slight easing of the set of his jaw, the way his hand found the small of her back for one brief, deliberate moment before falling away. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it. Not in the way that is a performance of being fine, but the way of someone who has let something finish properly. The way of completeness. He nodded once. They walked on. In the following weeks, the kingdom adjusted itself around the new reality, the way living things adjust. Not all at once, not without friction, but continuously, and in the end completely. The people of the castle and the surrounding territory came to see Vigora as what she was. Not immediately, not without the skepticism that is the right of any people asked to accept a 300-year-old lineage claim, but over time. She was patient with their skepticism and did not perform certainty she did not feel, and the combination of her patience and the honesty of the mark on her wrist and the evidence of the sealed archive records proved more convincing than any amount of ceremony could have been. She began to take on the functions that historically belonged to the Luna's role, not political governance, which was Silas's domain, and had run effectively without a Luna for 3 years, but the older functions, the mediation of pact disputes, the spiritual oversight of the seasonal ceremonies, the hearing of requests from the community's members who came not with legal matters, but with the harder, older kinds of problems that require not a judge but a listener. She was good at it. She had been preparing for it. She understood now, for her entire life. In every library, and every old text, and every conversation with the dying elder who had known things she had not been able to explain. In every moment of quiet, in a world that found her silence strange. In every act of careful attention, she had paid to people who thought they were unremarkable. Silas watched her do it with the expression she had begun to recognize as his particular form of pride. Not demonstrative, nothing like a man who says, "Look at you," but something in the alignment of his body when she walked into a room. Something in the quality of his attention when she spoke. The way he was always precisely where she could find him without hovering. The way he held space for her without filling it. He was, she had learned by now, a man of gestures rather than proclamations. He left books on the window seat of the library with passages marked that he thought she would find interesting. He had the kitchen staff quietly instructed to always have the honey bread available in case she was anxious, which meant it was available always. When she walked the perimeter in the early mornings, she had begun to do this on her own, having found the ritual useful. He appeared on the second morning and ran it with her without comment, and continued to appear every morning after that, and neither of them discussed it. He had begun, in the nights they spent together in the library or the garden, or walking the quiet castle corridors, to laugh more easily. It was still quiet, still infrequent, still arresting in the way of something rare, but it was coming more often, and with less surprise in it, as if he was slowly remembering the way. She was falling in love with him. She had been falling for some time. She had simply been very honest about it to herself, rather than pretending otherwise, which meant that when she arrived there, at the place where the falling stopped and the being in love began, at the place that was less momentum and more ground, she recognized it without confusion. She told him on an evening in the garden in the early spring, when the snow had finally given way to the particular gray-gold light that comes when winter breaks at altitude, and the world is simultaneously old and new. They had been sitting on the stone bench near the east garden wall, the one closest to the forest's edge, where his marker for Cassira was visible through the new bare branches. And the silence between them had been the comfortable, inhabited kind that takes time to build and feels like its own kind of speech. She said, "I love you." She said it very simply, without preamble or construction, the way she did most things that mattered. He turned and looked at her. His face did the thing she loved, the severity holding open like a door, the light coming through. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I have known for some time," he said. "I did not want to tell you that I knew without telling you something else first." He took her hand. His thumb moved against her knuckle with the same care he always used when he touched her. That deliberate tenderness that still surprised her, that was so completely at odds with every other register of him. "I love you. I am in love with you. I don't have a more complicated or qualifying way to say it, and I have decided I don't want one." Vigora looked at their joined hands, and at the early spring light on the garden wall, and at the forest beyond it where the marker stood. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not asking me to compete with her." "I never wanted you to," he said. "She was one life. You are another. The heart is not a fixed sum." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He pressed his jaw against the top of her head, the same gesture as that night in her room, sure and precise and warm. The garden was very quiet around them. The proposal was not performed. He did not call the court together or arrange a ceremony or present her with a formal declaration in front of witnesses. He asked her in the archive, on an afternoon when they were both deep in the old records, and she had been annotating the lineage scroll, and he had been reviewing the seasonal compact agreements, and neither of them had spoken in 40 minutes, and the silence between them was full and easy and entirely itself. He said, "Marry me." He said it the way he said things he had decided, simply, directly, with the complete absence of performance. Vigora looked up from the scroll. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, as if this had confirmed something he had been quietly certain of, and returned to the compact agreements. She looked at him for a moment. This enormous, serious, careful man with his black hair and his short beard and his hands that held ancient parchment, with the same deliberateness with which they held her, and felt the pulse in her chest beat with such clarity and completeness that she had to look back at the scroll before she did something she would not regret, but would embarrass herself with. She returned to the annotation. After a moment, he reached across and touched her hand, just briefly, just a press of his fingers against the back of her hand, and then he withdrew. She smiled at the scroll. The wedding was in the full spring. Not small. Aluna's wedding in the Northern Kingdom was a communal ceremony, belonging as much to the territory as to the individuals in it, and the community had opinions about how it should proceed. There were 3 days of traditional ceremony and 2 nights of celebration, and one very important morning ritual that required Vigora to stand at the eastern gate of the castle territory at sunrise and be formally received by representatives of every pack settlement in the Northern Territory, which was more people looking at her simultaneously than she had ever experienced. She wore her red cloak. The elders had suggested she wear the traditional silver of the Luna's ceremony, and she had listened carefully, and then said, with the gentle firmness that had become part of how people thought of her, that she intended to wear the red. Elder Mara had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Good." Silas met her at the gate. He wore the formal robes of the Alpha King and the dark ceremony marks on his forearms, and the expression of a man who has been standing in a cold dawn for 40 minutes and is completely indifferent to the cold because the cold is irrelevant to the thing he is waiting for. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, fully, directly, with the whole of his attention. She crossed the gate. He took her hands. Elder Mara performed the binding in the old language, and Vigora understood every word now. She had spent the preceding month with the ancient texts, until the old tongue was as natural to her as her own. The words of the binding were very old and very simple, the way things that have lasted centuries tend to become simple, stripped of everything that was not essential, distilled to the core. I see you. I choose you. I carry you forward. They said the words. The mark on her wrist lit silver in the morning light, and Silas Yerman, Alpha King of the Northern Territory, who had been alone in the way that only people who have loved deeply and lost deeply can be alone, who had governed with iron competence and grieved with absolute privacy, and refused for 3 years to let anyone suggest the world still had something to offer him. Silas brought her hands to his lips and pressed them there for a long, still moment with his eyes closed. When he opened them, they were very dark and very clear and entirely open. I love you, she thought, watching his face. I love you, and I'm not afraid of it, and I'm not apologizing for it, and it is not competing with anything. She felt him hear it, though she had not said it aloud. He did not need to say it in return. It was there in every line of him, in the arms that folded around her immediately after the formal binding concluded, in the warmth of him that she had been leaning into since that first night, in the way he stood facing her and not the assembled court, as if the court were peripheral to the only thing that was actually happening. Behind them, the territory celebrated. There was music from the community settlements, traditional instruments, the deep-toned strings, and the high clear pipes of the mountain regions. There were fires lit along the castle walls as the sun rose. There were children running through the castle gates, in the particular way of children at celebrations, directed by no one, and in the way of everyone, and somehow entirely appropriate to the occasion. Essa, the healer, was crying with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who does not believe in performing emotions she is not having. Eris, former dissenter, now one of the Luna's most consistent administrative advocates, with the efficiency of a man who changes his position only once, but changes it completely, stood with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who is privately moved and is choosing to express this by standing very straight. The morning light was extraordinary. Spring morning light at altitude has a quality that is not available elsewhere, thin and gold, and somehow both brilliant and gentle, as if the sun remembers the winter and is choosing gentleness in its relief at being back. Vigora stood in it with Silas's arm around her and the silver mark bright on her wrist and the pulse in her chest finally, completely, at rest. Not gone, present, vivid, but no longer searching. It had found what it was oriented toward and settled into it the way a compass settles when it has found true north. She thought of the caravan. She thought of the men's voices and their contempt, and the torchlight disappearing into the white dark. She thought of her knees in the snow, and the cold inside her, and the small stubborn part of her that had believed in the existence of something better, without knowing what it looked like. It looked like this. A castle full of spring light. An old silver mark on her wrist, 3 centuries in the making. A man with black waves and dark eyes, and a laugh that arrived quietly, when it arrived, and changed everything about a room. The world had not been withholding from her. The world had been waiting. She had simply needed to survive the winter long enough to see it. In the years that followed, the Northern Kingdom became something it had not been in a very long time. Not simply strong, which it had always been, but whole. The mark on Vigora's wrist remained silver, and she came to understand that it brightened slightly during the seasonal ceremonies, particularly the spring rites and the winter solstice, when the territory's spiritual balance was most actively invoked. She did not understand everything about what that meant. She suspected she never would, fully. But she had stopped needing to understand everything in order to proceed. Had learned, through the long practice of her first years as Luna, that some things are more honored by living them than by explaining them. She continued to read the old texts. She had, by the second year, read most of the archive. She had begun to annotate the lineage records, not correcting them, but adding to them, the way all living histories are added to. Her handwriting appeared in the margins alongside notations 3 centuries old, and the archivist handled this with a reverence she found slightly excessive and genuinely touching. Silas continued to govern with the controlled ferocity that kept the northern territories stable and respected. He was not easier with the world, because that was not who he was, and she had never wanted him to be. He was large and severe and completely inflexible about certain things, and had the social warmth of a mountain in formal settings. And the delegations from neighboring kingdoms who met him for the first time occasionally came to her afterward with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had expected something different. She explained to them gently that what they had encountered was not coldness, but precision, that there was a significant difference. That if they were patient and direct and honest in their dealings, they would find him not only fair, but, in time, something rather better than fair. She did not tell them about the garden, or the laugh, or the way he pressed his jaw against the top of her head when she was tired and the whole of him became a shelter. Those things belonged to her. They were not for the delegations. The stone marker at the forest's edge remained where it was. Vigora had been the one to suggest, in the first spring, that they tend the area around it, plant something, give it the care of living attention. Silas had looked at her when she suggested it with the expression of a man who has been offered something he did not know he was allowed to want. They had planted snowdrops. Small, early, white, the first flowers of the year, the ones that come through snow without asking permission. It was right, they both understood, without needing to discuss why. On the morning of the 2nd anniversary of the wedding, Vigora walked out to the marker at the forest's edge and stood there for a while. Not performing grief that was not hers to have, not presuming, but present and respectful, and carrying some quality of acknowledgement that was more honest than ceremony. She said very quietly, to the marker and the snowdrops and the winter forest, "Thank you for loving him first. Thank you for shaping him into the person he was when I found him. The love he learned with you is part of how he loves me, and I am grateful for it." She stood there until she was cold. Then she walked back to the castle, where Silas was in the kitchen, a development that had occurred gradually over 18 months, and which he had never directly acknowledged, and which the kitchen staff had accepted with the equanimity of people who have decided that some things are simply true now. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the kitchen and went to him and put her arms around him from behind and held on. His hands came to rest over hers. They stood like that for a long time, in the warm kitchen, in the castle that had been silent and was now alive again, in the life they had made out of a storm and a red cloak and the stubborn, patient, extraordinary fact of 2 people finding each other. Outside, the snowdrops were blooming. Spring was coming, as it always does, over the mountains, patient and certain and indifferent to the winters that precede it. It does not ask the snow's permission. It simply arrives, and the light changes, and the world discovers it has survived into something new. This is the way of things. The cold does not always end you. Sometimes the cold is just the last dark mile of the road that leads you exactly where you were always meant to be. To a fire, to a name spoken in a low voice in a quiet corridor, to arms that have decided to hold you and hold you and hold you until the held feeling is simply the shape of your days, to a kingdom that was waiting, to a heart that had forgotten how to open, and then, in a snowstorm, on a mountain road, found the one thing in the world capable of reminding it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.